Welcome, everyone, to The Deep Dive. Today we're taking on something pretty ambitious. We're trying to piece together insights from really different historical moments.
Yeah, we're talking about the fall of Byzantium, the very shaky start of English colonies in America, even the basics of ancient farming.
Exactly. And the goal is to pull out a kind of, universal concept from all this.
Hmm.
We're hunting for the administrative blueprint, the core operating system, if you like, that decides if these huge human projects succeed or, well, fail spectacularly.
It's really about comparing how people govern or try to govern. We've got sources covering Byzantium's long decline, the, frankly, staggering incompetence of the early pilgrims, and then these deep dives into what makes a state tick. Political theory, even the biology of agriculture.
We're searching for that fundamental toolkit that makes any state actually work, whatever its ideology or time period.
Right, so we're not just reading history, are we? We're treating it more like a huge data set.
Yeah, comparing, say, Ottoman imperial strategy with 17th century venture capitalists who just couldn't get it right. What's the thread connecting an emperor ditching his navy to a pilgrim forgetting to pack a cow? It sounds absurd, but...
It's all about organization, or the lack of it. We see these contrasting philosophies. One, the Ottoman one, really adaptable, synthesizing things, looking long-term. The other, well, driven by greed and just amazing short-sightedness. Let's start where the failures really became seismic. The slow, painful end of the Byzantine Empire.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our sources point to the Battle of Manzikert back in 1071 CE as the real starting gun for that long decline. It wasn't just losing a battle, was it? It was the start of this, irreversible administrative rot.
Manzikert, 1071. Yeah, it's often called the defeat of seismic proportions, and that's about right. But the weird thing is, back in Constantinople, the news didn't immediately signal, total doom.
So it wasn't seen as the end of the world right away.
No, not quite. It was definitely a big loss, a serious setback, but the full catastrophic effect. That wasn't grasped initially. The real tragedy wasn't just the soldiers' loss on the field, though that was bad enough. It was the huge geopolitical shift it allowed.
What actually changed on the ground? What made this defeat different from, say, earlier ones?
Well, before Manzikert, the Turkmen, this rising Turkish power, they were mostly raiding. They'd sweep into Anatolia, grab what they could, livestock, wealth, and then pull back.
Hit and run, basically.
Exactly. After 1071, that changed completely. Their presence became permanent. They started shifting from just raiding to full-on settlement. They were there to stay.
And Anatolia, geographically, was kind of perfect for them, wasn't it? Which must have sped things up.
Absolutely. The sources really highlight this. The high rolling plateau of Anatolia, it suited their Central Asian nomadic lifestyle down to the ground.
So perfect grazing land for their herds.
Perfect. It let them maintain their whole way of life yurts, two humped camels, the lot, while effectively colonizing the land. They weren't just invaders passing through, they were settlers whose lifestyle was perfectly adapted to that environment.
That sounds less like a temporary military loss and more like a mass migration that just instantly changed who held the power in the region.
It was a fundamental remapping. And the speed of it is pretty startling when you look at it. By the 1220s, that's barely 150 years after Manzikert Western writers weren't even calling it Roman land anymore.
What are they calling it?
Turkey. Turkey. That linguistic shift, that cultural marker, it tells you the empire had permanently lost its grip, administratively and geographically, on its own heartland.
And losing Anatolia wasn't just about losing territory, like changing the lines on a map. It meant the empire lost its core resources. Right?
Oh, absolutely fatal in the long run. Byzantium got its main food supply from Anatolia, and crucially, the manpower for its armies.
The thematic armies, yeah.
Right. When the Turkmen settled there, those logistical bases just vanished. Forever. The empire was forced into this long, painful contraction, and this resource strain, combined with some really serious internal administrative failures, well, that just hurried the end along. Hashtag B, internal weakness and symbolic decay.
What's really striking here is how the sources stress the internal problems, that the decline was accelerated from within, almost self-inflicted, you could say, even before the Ottomans became the main threat. It seems like the Byzantines were kind of actively dismantling their own operational structure.
That's a really key administrative lesson, isn't it? Empires often rot from the inside out before they get conquered. Take the civil aristocracy in Constantinople.
Okay.
They consistently put their own power, their own fiscal comfort, ahead of the empire's security. When Emperor Isaac Comnenos stepped down in 1059, the civil church group put Constantine X Doukas in charge.
And he was more of a bureaucrat.
Yeah, a scholar focused on administration in the capital. But his fiscal policies, they were disastrous long-term. He went back to policies that really hurt the empire's defense.
And what did those policies actually do? What were the immediate effects?
Well, fundamentally, he debased the coinage. He reduced the amount of precious metal in the coins.
Inflation, basically.
Pretty much. And when the currency loses value, who gets hit hardest first? The army, especially soldiers stationed far from the capital. Military service becomes less attractive, and military spending gets cut while the civil service in Constantinople grows.
So he traded military strengths for, like, bureaucratic expansion and maybe some short-term budget balancing.
That's exactly it. It's a classic sign of imperial decay, sacrificing long-term security for short-term political convenience, assuming you can save money by neglecting the very thing that protects your wealth.
It's the ultimate administrative blunder. And this neglect eventually led to what one source dramatically calls the suicidal decision. What was that?
Okay, get this. In 1284, Emperor Andronicos decided to just abolish the imperial navy, the entire thing.
You're kidding. An empire surrounded by water, totally dependent on sea control.
It's hard to wrap your head around the short-sightedness. The thinking, presumably, was just that it was cheaper to disband the fleet than to maintain it.
But what happened to the sailors? They were just going to, take up farming, were they?
Not a chance. The result was direct and immediate. These highly skilled, now unemployed sailors, they just defected.
And let me guess, who was happy to hire them?
The rising Ottomans, of course, who were very eager to build up their own naval power. So the Byzantines didn't just lose their navy, they actively handed over the talent and the know-how that let their biggest rival build a powerful fleet. It's self-sabotage, actually, providing infrastructure to your enemy.
Wow. So the internal collapse was so total, it was even reflected in the empire's big symbol, the double-headed eagle. I mean, we usually think of that symbolizing power, looking east and west, all that.
Right, that's the common image.
But the sources suggest something much darker, more bureaucratic.
That's where the symbolism gets kind of grimly prophetic.
Yeah.
Around 1325, they adopt the double-headed eagle. But the source clarifies, by that point, it didn't really symbolize dominion. It reflected the actual political reality, a division of authority between two emperors from the same family constantly quarreling.
So not strength, but internal conflict.
Exactly. It wasn't a symbol of a mighty unified empire. It was basically a public admission of fragmentation and disagreement right at the very top. Bureaucratic infighting made manifest, ####C, the calamitous century, and failed appeals.
Okay, so this internal rot, the fragmentation, the military neglect, it all set the stage for what the sources call the calamitous century after 1300. Sounds like just one crisis after another.
It really was a perfect storm of existential threats, you could say. You had the
Yeah.
fragmentation from within. You had ruinous civil war tearing the place apart between 1341 and 1371.
Decades of civil war.
Yeah. Then constant invasions, the Ottomans, obviously, but also the powerful Serbian state, add in relentless religious controversy dividing people, and then the big one.
The Black Death.
Constantinople was hit particularly hard. It was actually the first European city to experience the plague, which of course just hammered the manpower issues they already had from losing Anatolia.
Trying to run a city, defend it, when your population's collapsing, your money's worthless, and your leaders are fighting each other, it sounds impossible.
Pretty much. And this pushed the emperors into these final desperate appeals to the Christian West for help. And the things they were offering shows how desperate they were. They were essentially giving away huge chunks of territory just for immediate military muscle.
Like what? What were they offering?
Emperor Constantine offered places like Salimbria or Mesembria, strategic towns on the Black Sea, to Hunyadi of Hungary. He offered the entire island of Lemnos to Alfonso of Aragon and Naples. These were massive concessions, just begging for troops for logistical support.
And how did the West respond? Particularly Venice, which had huge interests in the region. Their reaction really shows where the administrative priorities of Europe had shifted, doesn't it? It wasn't about religion anymore.
It really wasn't about ideology, it was about the supply chain. It's quite stunning. Despite all the calls for Christian solidarity, the West was mostly reluctant, evasive.
But the Venetian Senate?
Their reaction is the ultimate administrative litmus test. They were worried, yes, but mostly about threats to their Black Sea trade routes. That was their core business. So they sent instructions to their commanders. Protect Christians? Fine, but without giving offense to the Turks.
Wow. Protect our stuff, but don't annoy the new boss. That's basically it, isn't it?
That's exactly it. It's a complete acceptance that Byzantium was finished. Fighting the Ottomans was seen as fiscally and logistically too risky, the smart administrative move. Start negotiating trade terms with the inevitable winner.
They understood that ideological ties meant nothing if they disrupted the flow of goods and money. They were already pivoting, weren't they? Moving their focus from propping up a dying empire to figuring out the logistics of doing business with the Ottoman future.
Precisely. Business sense trumped everything else.
Okay, that contrast is incredible. On one hand, you've got this ancient empire literally imploding because of self-sabotage and internal fighting, and on the other, the rising Ottomans showing this really sophisticated administrative approach, what you called organizational synthesis.
Yeah, what's really fascinating about the Ottomans isn't just that they won battles, it's that they created this unique assemblage, as one source puts it, of different elements. They were masters of adaptive administration, a skill the Byzantines seem to have completely lost.
So they weren't just smashing things and starting over, they were actually integrating the existing infrastructure of the places they took over.
That's the key. They combined their own Turkish tribal traditions, Sunni Islam, Persian court practices, but crucially, they didn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. They imported and used the existing Byzantine administrative structure.
Things like tax systems, record keeping.
Exactly. Registers, tax rolls, even certain court ceremonies. They essentially took over the existing operating system and just changed the management at the top.
Which must have given them instant functional control over these huge new territories. They didn't have to spend 100 years figuring out who owned what field or how to collect taxes.
Right. That efficiency gives you immediate stability. It's a massive advantage for building a lasting empire. And on top of that, they brought in a system of, let's call it strategic religious toleration.
Okay, but let's push back on toleration a bit. Under Islamic law, Christians were people of the book. Yes, they got protection. But that protection often came with strings attached, like paying the jizya, the poll tax, right? It sounds more like stability bought through a kind of fiscal pressure, maybe.
That's a fair point. It definitely wasn't modern tolerance. It was pragmatic, but you have to look at it in the context of the time. Compared to what some groups were experiencing under late Byzantine rule, it offered a different kind of administrative stability.
How so?
Well, the sources suggest that some schismatic Christian groups considered heretical by the mainstream Greek Orthodox Church, were actually tired of being persecuted by their fellow Christians.
So the Turks offered them freedom from that kind of religious infighting.
In a way, yes. We have accounts, like one from Michael the Syrian, suggesting these groups sometimes preferred Turkish rule. They saw it as bringing justice and good government.
Because the Turks weren't interested in those fine points of theology.
Exactly. The sources say the Turks weren't really in the habit of digging into specific Christian doctrines or persecuting people over subtle theological differences, which had become pretty common under the later Byzantines. These groups saw the Greeks as wicked and heretical, whereas the Turks were seen as relatively impartial administrators in religious matters. This administrative neutrality, even if conditional, bought the Ottomans a degree of internal peace and stability, and that's a critical function of good governance.
Okay, so that Ottoman success, this organizational synthesis, makes the contrast with the early English attempts over in America almost
Fair.
comical. If the Ottomans were giving a master class in state building, the pilgrims seemed like a case study in what you call speculative mania and just pure logistical self-sabotage.
The motivation really does tell you everything. These early English ventures, they weren't grand state-sponsored projects designed for long-term empire. They were funded by venture capitalists.
Like a 17th century dot-com boom.
Kind of, yeah. They were looking for a quick return gold, valuable furs, sassafras, whatever they could ship back quickly for cash. This intense financial pressure for immediate profit, it incentivized cutting corners, incompetence, just really bad planning.
You mentioned speculative mania. What's the most glaring example of logistical failure driven by that mindset?
Well, take the Pilgrims arriving in 1620. They signed up for this venture, and they land in New England just 6 weeks before a brutal winter hits. And they arrive without nearly enough food, and crucially, without any adequate shelter already built.
Their basic preparation for just staying alive was almost non-existent. It sounds like they thought they'd just find riches lying around, or that survival would be easy.
Pretty much driven by that hope for quick returns. And then there's the refusal to hire Captain John Smith.
The experienced guy who actually knew the area. Why wouldn't they hire him? Unless it was about saving money.
It looks like pure hubris mixed with cost-cutting. They wouldn't pay his fee. They figured they could just use the maps in his book instead. What happened?
I got lost.
They spent several frigid weeks, as the source says, just scouting around Cape Cod, totally unprepared, getting sick. People died unnecessarily during that period. They paid a heavy price for that administrative decision to cheap out on expertise.
And their plan for actually feeding themselves long-term.
Logistically, a complete shambles. Their main plan seemed to be fishing for export, Ray.
Oh.
But the fishing gear they brought was totally wrong for the New England coast. Useless.
Okay, that's bad.
And then there's the truly baffling part. They didn't bring any livestock. No cows, no sheep, no mules or horses.
Wait, none. How do you start a permanent settlement, a farm, anything without basic draft animals? Or a reliable source of milk, wool, sustained protein?
Exactly. Forget the cow. That's like launching a tech startup without a computer. It's administrative malpractice on an epic scale, and it led directly to disaster.
How bad was it?
About half the people who came over on the Mayflower 102 died during that first winter. And how the survivors made it through. Well, according to Governor Bradford's own account, it involved some pretty morally dubious actions that just highlight their total lack of planning.
This is where the sources mention robbing indigenous graves and houses. That's shocking. It really speaks to how desperate things were.
Bradford wrote about it. They were starving, freezing. They stumbled upon caches of food that Native Americans had stored for the winter, corn, beans, and yeah, they raided burial sites and storage pits, hauled about 10 bushels of maize back to the ship in a kettle they'd also found.
Sound right.
Winslow later wrote, "It was God's good providence they found the corn, because otherwise we know not how we should have done." They were, in Bradford's words, utterly dependent on native charity and, well, theft, just to survive their own staggering logistical failures.
And yet, even after nearly dying, they seem to have remained incredibly incurious about the very environment they were now totally dependent on.
This is another critical failure, cultural, administrative, you name it. Thoreau pointed this out later. He contrasted these colonists with woods people who actually knew how to live in that environment. The Pilgrims landed December 16th. It wasn't until January 8th, nearly a month later, that the first person, Francis Billington, apparently wandered just 2 miles inland.
A whole month, and only one guy went 2 miles.
They were just paralyzed, it seems. Paralyzed by their lack of preparation, their lack of knowledge, waiting for the environment to somehow provide, rather than actively trying to understand and master it.
Okay, so we've seen grand strategy and small-scale incompetence. But underneath both the Ottoman success and the Pilgrim failure, there are these fundamental things that make any successful state possible. Let's look at 3 foundations now. How we record claims, how we feed ourselves, and how we maintain power. ###############################################################################################################################################################################################################################################################################################################################################################################################
fundamental. It's what lets large groups of strangers cooperate over time and space. It transfers knowledge, rules, claims beyond the memory of just one person or one tribe.
We often think of writing for poetry or history,
Right.
but its earliest uses were much more mundane, right?
Absolutely. Think about Mesopotamia, cuneiform, the earliest known writing system. It was developed primarily for accounting, tracking grain stores, who owned which bit of land, how many days laborers worked. Pure bureaucracy.
So writing starts as admin.
And in the medieval period, as our sources note, writing became this powerful agent in provoking new lithogenres of material signaling about ancestry, genealogy, ownership, and place. Moving legal claims, administrative records from stuff that decays, like memory or papyrus, onto something permanent.
And that permanent thing was often stone. The sources talk about lithic time. Why was carving things in rock so important for state administration?
Because the goal was monumental memory, enduring law. The slow materiality of stone, its resistance to decay, was deliberately used to make human words, especially claims of ownership, law, ancestry last across generations, to survive fire, flood, political chaos.
They acted as time marks, the source says, linking words to physical monuments.
Exactly. If you carve your law, your claim to land, into a big stone stela like Hammurabi did, you're establishing something public, potentially unchallengeable, something that aims to outlast governments. That's the bedrock of long-term state stability.
It creates institutional memory, right? Without that durable record, every new administration, every generation almost has to start over figuring things out. The state can't really function if basic things like ownership and law are constantly up for grabs.
Precisely. Can't have stable administration without stable records.
Okay, so writing records ownership, which leads to the next big question. What does a state need to own and manage above all else: food. And here the sources point out this huge fundamental difference between how agriculture developed in Eurasia versus the Americas. This had massive administrative consequences.
Yeah, the Neolithic Revolution in the Middle East, it was almost like biology gave them an administrative head start. It kicked off when people found and started planting naturally occurring variants of wild wheat and barley.
Variants that didn't shatter. What did that mean?
It means the seeds stayed attached to the stalk when ripe, instead of scattering everywhere. This made them incredibly easy for early farmers to harvest, just cut the stalk and then replant deliberately. A simple genetic mutation made large-scale farming much, much easier.
Which led to surpluses, specialization, bureaucracy.
Right, boosted yields rapidly. But in the Americas, the process was way slower, way more complex, partly because of those big extinction events much earlier.
Remind us about that.
Around 13,000 years ago, maybe linked to human arrival, about 80% of the large wild mammal species in the Americas went extinct. Mammoths, native horses, camels, sloths. Gone.
Which left?
Very few candidates for domestication. Only 5 significant species were eventually domesticated in the Americas: the turkey, the llama alpaca, the guinea pig, the muscovy duck, and the dog. They completely lacked the big herd animals, cattle, horses, sheep, goats that were so vital in Eurasia.
Vital for what? Labor, transport.
Labor, transport, fertilizer for fields, wool, milk, hides, and also, critically, building up human resistance to zoonotic diseases through long exposure.
And even their main staple crop, maize or corn, was incredibly difficult compared to Eurasian grains.
Maize is really an outlier genetically. It's so different from its wild ancestor, teosinte. The big problem is domesticated maize can't really reproduce on its own. Those kernels are wrapped up tight in that tough husk.
Because humans have to intervene to plant it.
Exactly. Humans have to physically remove the kernels from the husk and plant them. Teosinte, its wild ancestor, looks totally different. Barely edible grains that shatter easily. Wild wheat or rice, you can gather them and eat them pretty easily. Maize had to be fundamentally reshaped by human effort.
So it wasn't just finding a lucky mutation like with wheat. It was active, complex genetic manipulation over a long time.
Yes. The genetics are complex. Transforming teosinte into maize involved changes in at least 16 different genes controlling things like kernel exposure and stalk structure. It was such a massive transformation that the Mexican National Museum of Culture apparently used to claim maize wasn't domesticated. It was created almost from scratch.
Wow. And the administrative implication?
It means early American states, like the Aztecs or Maya, faced a much bigger organizational challenge just to produce their staple food compared to, say, Mesopotamians or Egyptians. They had to manage the intensive labor needed for a crop that was essentially a human invention without the benefit of large draft animals. That's a heavy administrative burden right from the start. ###C. The principles of maintaining authority. Machiavelli and Rome.
Okay, so we've got the admin tech writing, we've got the logistical base food with all its complications. The final piece, for any state that lasts, is authority. How do you maintain power? And for that, we turn to Machiavelli, who brings us right back, almost full circle, to a really basic administrative rule. Don't make people hate you too much.
Machiavelli's advice is famously brutally pragmatic. He says a prince can be feared. Fear is useful, controllable even, but he absolutely must avoid being hated. And how does the ruthless prince manage that? By keeping his hands off 2 specific things.
Which are?
The property of his citizens and subjects and their women.
It's kind of amazing. In a handbook for rulers who might need to be ruthless, property rights come up as this ultimate administrative red line.
It really speaks to what the state is fundamentally built on, doesn't it? Machiavelli gives us that chilling, famous line, "Men more quickly forget the death of their father than the loss of their patrimony."
Patrimony meaning their inheritance, their property.
Yeah, their property, their means of livelihood, the foundation of their family's economic stability, their future. You can mourn a death, Machiavelli implies, but you can maybe recover. If the state takes away everything you own, your entire means of subsistence, that breeds a hatred that never goes away.
So seizing property is an administrative failure because it destroys the tax base and creates this permanent simmering resentment.
That's the core of it. Machiavelli warns that excuses for taking property are always easy to find for a greedy ruler. But reasons for executing someone, they're harder to find and maybe fade faster. For Machiavelli, real authority rests on understanding the, let's say, sanctity of ownership for stability, the need for predictable rules, not just random violence.
And the Roman emperors, Machiavelli notes, faced a particularly tricky version of this administrative balancing act.
Oh, absolutely. They were caught in this constant bind. They had to satisfy the general populace, who mostly wanted peace and stability. But they also had to satisfy the soldiers.
Who were the source of their power.
Exactly. And the soldiers, Machiavelli says, loved a certain kind of emperor, warlike, bold, cruel, and rapacious. Why? Because that kind of emperor let the soldiers themselves be bold, cruel, and rapacious towards the populace, allowing them to basically extort double pay.
So the soldiers wanted a license to loot their own people.
Essentially, yes. So emperors often tilted towards keeping the soldiers happy, but the fatal mistake was losing authority over those soldiers. If the soldiers stopped fearing or respecting the emperor, it was game over. And we see this with someone like Antoninus Caracalla.
Caracalla. He was popular with the army because he was warlike, gave them raises, but everyone else hated him for his brutality. How did his administrative failure play out?
He made a basic, almost personal administrative error. He had the brother of one of his own centurions, a man named Macrinus, who was in his personal guard, killed in a really insulting way. But then, unbelievably, Caracalla kept Macrinus in his service right beside him.
That seems unwise.
Reckless disregard for basic loyalty and the consequences of injury. Macrinus, driven by what the Force calls resolved and desperate courage, waits for his moment and arranges for Caracalla to be assassinated while traveling right in the middle of his army. Authority didn't collapse because of some grand strategic blunder, but because the emperor failed to manage the basic logistics of personal loyalty and resentment among the very tools of his power.
Okay, so this deep dive, it's really shown us, hasn't it? Whether you look at the Ottomans, who were so good at synthesizing, adapting existing administrative systems, or you look at the English pilgrims, whose survival literally depended on theft because their venture capitalist backers were so short-sighted. It seems like the durability of any state, big or small, really comes down to the quality of its internal administration.
Yeah, we saw the Byzantine Empire basically crumble from the inside because of administrative rot, messing with the money, ditching the navy, even their symbols reflecting division. And then you have Machiavelli, the ultimate pragmatist, saying the biggest threat to a ruler isn't some foreign invasion, it's messing up the most basic administrative task. Don't steal your people's stuff.
The lesson seems pretty clear. History, maybe politics too, often just boils down to the nitty-gritty. The quality of the organization, the reliability of the supply chain, the ability to keep decent records.
And if we connect that right back to the very beginnings, think about it. We mentioned cuneiform in Mesopotamia, the earliest writing we know of, developed mostly for admin, for accounting, tracking resources, people, property.
Right.
And at the same time, thousands of years later, Machiavelli's prince, the symbol of ultimate power, is constrained by basically the same things. Accounting for those resources, and crucially, not stealing them.
Which leaves us with a final thought, maybe a provocative question for you, the listener, to think about. If the earliest forms of writing and some of the most ruthless strategies for holding power were both fundamentally about bureaucratic needs, about keeping track of who owns what resources are available, does that suggest that the state, really, whatever its flag or ideology, is at its absolute core just an administrative ledger, a system designed primarily to manage resources, people, and ownership?
Maybe the only truly successful state, at the end of the day, is the one that keeps the best, most accurate, and most durable books.
Something to ponder. Thanks for joining us for the deep dive. We'll see you next time.